Hello, my name is Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And this is part of my Occult 101 series, though this is a little bit more of an advanced Occult 101 video, because it's a question that's actually kind of complicated. But anyways, Occult 101 is a series that I've been doing. It's the flagship series of my channel. I've been doing it for about over 4 years now, where I give beginner introductions to complex esoteric and occult topics so you can have that basic information and then springboard and jump into deeper research and help you develop your path. Without further ado, let's get into this video. And this video is, what is traditional witchcraft, or tradcraft? It is often called. So this question is kind of interesting because a lot of people jump to a specific tradition as the answer, but this term is actually used by a lot of different people, and depending on who you ask, it does mean something very different. And so if someone does approach you and says, I'm a tradcraft practitioner, that could be a tongue twister, honestly, that word. You kind of don't entirely know what they mean. So I do want to explore all the traditions that claim the label of traditional witchcraft, explore if they really are traditional witchcraft, what this actually means, and if this term is really as useful as people act like it is. So to begin, the first group that I think most people think of when they are discussing traditional witchcraft is this kind of, I would call it an anti-Wicca witchcraft movement. Hear me out on this. So for most of religious history, the term witch is not really a self-identifier, right? Most people who have been called witches would not claim that, right? We look at traditional magical traditions, including folk magic and folkloric traditions, a lot of the things that people cite as like, what is witchcraft? Most people who practice those would be rather offended if you claimed this. Because when we look at like prehistory, antiquity, and then later times like the Renaissance and so on, there was always this kind of distinction about magic, right? People often say, oh, magic was illegal. That's not correct. Witchcraft was. And this distinction kind of matters, and throughout history, people really held on to it. I like specifically the definition that the Hellenic world gave, where they actually broke magic into kind of 3 categories of theurgia, or divine magic of the gods. That would be most mysticism and a lot of ceremonial magic. Magia naturalis, and that is magic that involves sort of the natural world. That would be your planetary magic, your plant magic, those type of traditions, and then Goetia. And Goetia, and I'm not referring to the Ars Goetia of the Solomonic tradition, that infamous demonic grimoire. No, I am referring to Goetia in the traditional sense. This kind of referred to the term of sorcery, or malefic, the bad magic. This moralization has existed for most of history, right? And if we look at like kind of one of the earliest phrasings used to actually define witchcraft, we actually have to look to the Bible. Yes, I mean the Christian Bible, where their whole the whole witch should not live, right? Witches should die verse, I'm sure we all know that, actually uses the Latin word of beneficia. And beneficia does translate to witch, but it more directly translates to poisoner or sorcerer. We see something similar in the Islamic tradition, where their word that kind of refers to witch is sahir, or sorcerer. And this poisoner connotation is very interesting because it does imply the witch is inherently a malefic thing, right? And when we look at like European witch trial records, one of the big things discussed when people were tried for witchcraft under the Christian European persecution is this poison plant thing going on, right? They were accused of using flying ointments made out of poison plants, right? There's this big association between witchcraft and poison throughout history. So when we get kind of closer to the modern day, witch was still kind of being used in a pretty negative way until Wicca. Now, Wicca is the witch religion started by English occultist Gerald Gardner. Gardner had spent many years inside Thelema in the Ordo Templi Orientis, and then broke off, and he, according to his telling of the story, he met these women called the New Forest Coven, who had been a surviving English witch religion since before Christianity, who were in the New Forest in the United Kingdom, and basically initiated him into their traditional religion. And then he actually combined that with those ceremonial and Western esoteric techniques and created the religion of Wicca. So Wicca is kind of like an adapted version of this traditional witchcraft religion, right? Now, when we look at the people who first started using this term traditional witchcraft, let's be real, that all happened after Wicca. Witch being used as a self-descriptor, something where people say, yeah, I'm a witch, that's pretty much a post-Wicca thing. There are not many people before that who were using that term in that way, right? But The thing is, not all people who self-identify as a witch like Wicca. Specifically, the problem with Wicca that started the sort of anti-Wicca witchcraft movement was that Wicca is too moralizing, right? So within Wicca, it has this whole "an ye harm none" thing. And there is this specific poem called The Wiccan Raid. Now, to be clear, Gerald Gardner did not write The Wiccan Raid, but most Wiccans do accept it as a kind of moral code. And Wicca very explicitly states that it is good witchcraft. It would not have been what was defined as Goetia or sorcery historically. It is simply a European folk religion. And since people who had European folk traditions were so often demonized as witches and falsely persecuted, it is a kind of reclaiming of the term. As well, Wicca, the term they use, derives from wise. So it is the sort of religion of the wise, the religion of the English people. Now, people had a problem with some of this moralizing because the thing is, in practice, most Wiccans are very love and light oriented, and a lot of people don't like that as a cosmology because there is dark in the universe, right? It's not all good love and light, and so a lot of people think Wicca is kind of like watered down. And if you compare Wicca to a lot of traditional pagan religions, like, you see a bit of a gap, right? Wicca is very love and light oriented. And so you get people who are going, well, that's not what witchcraft is. Witchcraft is something different. And the big person who steps forward and kind of starts the anti-Wicca traditional witch movement and is often cited as one of the fathers of traditional witchcraft is an occultist named Paul Hewson. He is another English guy, and he writes this book called Mastering Witchcraft. And this was written quite after Wicca was started, so now we're about in the 60s and 70s timeline-wise. Wicca started in the 40s and 50s, we're in the 60s and 70s, and if we look at like the cultural trends of the 60s and 70s, we see society changing on like a zeitgeist level. And so he says, you know what? Witchcraft is incendiary, right? Witchcraft does stand in opposition to the Christian traditions. It does stand in opposition to Christian moralizing, which Wicca doesn't really do that. Wicca does claim it is like the pre-religion, it is the correct religion, right? But it doesn't like really oppose Christianity. It doesn't take a spiritually adversarial stance, right? Wicca, if we're using the dichotomy of the right-hand path and the left-hand path, which I don't 100% agree with, but so many people do use it, I do think it's worth bringing up. Wicca's very right-hand path, right? And this Paul Hewson stuff is very left-hand path. And he incorporates kind of like edgier themes, right? Themes of the adversary, themes of heavy topics, right? There's much less moralizing. In his book, Mastering Witchcraft, there are targeted love spells to seduce specific people, a thing that a lot of Wiccans have a problem with. He thinks cursing is okay. He thinks it's okay to kind of step on other religions, right? It is edgier, it is transgressive, and what comes from this is the idea that to be a witch is to transgress, right? We think of the archetype of the witch. This is kind of the argument, right? The archetype of the witch is not just a wise person in the woods, right? That's not really what people are talking about when they're talking about the archetype of the witch. The archetype of the witch is this kind of Hecatian outsider figure, right? And being that outsider figure, that kind of black sheep of society, is very much what witchcraft is. And so witchcraft should be a transgressive tradition. And actually it raises some parallels between this and kind of like Tantra. So when we look at like the word left-hand path, that actually originates from a Hindu dichotomy. And specifically, it's like, are you gaining your mysticism through non-transgressive acts or are you doing transgressive acts? And the reason for transgression as a mystical formula is one, that it does go against our psyche, and so that inherently has a ritualistic power. But also, when you discover that there is religion within the transgressive, right, you are realizing that there is divinity through all, right? It is actually a divine thing in of itself. Like, if you look at the Aghoris, the most extreme left-hand path set, who like, you know, they're in the East, they're an Eastern tradition, and they like hang around dead bodies and shit and all of this. And the point of that is not just to be an edgelord, but to understand that even in the most repulsive situations, there is still divinity, right? The Godhead still exists. And I will say this about Paul Hewson. If you read his later works, I have Liber Spiritum, which is his sort of personal grimoire that was published. He actually has a very strong ceremonial magic influence, which is really interesting since he does kind of bash on Christianity within Mastering Witchcraft, but then he does like invoke the angels and do a lot of like ceremonial hermetic style Golden Dawn magic in his personal practice. So there's something interesting to explore there. And one thing I do want to touch on is, as much as these tradcraft sects very much claim to be detached from the rest of Western esotericism, they do often still overlap a bit. But anyways, his techniques, like if you look at the techniques of like the Paul Hewson lineage, it is quite interesting because it has all these witchcraft transgressive themes, but it actually has a pretty ceremonial structure to it. Things that will be familiar to people who have that kind of Western esoteric ceremonial background. Now, the next group that kind of does claim the traditional witchcraft label, and I actually have a whole video on them, is Sabbatic witchcraft. So Sabbatic witchcraft is the product of Chumbly, who is a big occult figure. He was very close with Austin Osman Spare, who is sort of the predecessor to chaos magic. Austin Osman Spare was very close with Kenneth Grant, the guy who created Typhonian Thelema, which is kind of a, how do I explain Typhonian Thelema? It's Thelema, but not solar, and a bit more antinomian, and it redefines how Kabbalah works. And when a lot of people discuss things like the Qliphoth and whatnot, like they're actually citing Kenneth Grant, he has his own very unique take on things. It's kind of lunar in a lot of ways. I could do a video on that. I really cannot explain Typhonian Thelema in the amount of time this video is and still get to traditional witchcraft. It's a whole can of worms. But anyways, Eospare, big connection there, and Eospare, Chumbly, big connection there. And so these all three kind of like link together, meaning that this is once again a lineage of Western esotericism, as is most Western mystical traditions. Now, what gets interesting is Sabbatic witchcraft really does lean into this witch Sabbat idea. So in the Christian witch trials, there was this frequent accusation that women were taking poisonous herbs and creating these concoctions known as flying ointments and then applying that to broomsticks and sticking it up their, please YouTube don't kill me with this, vaginal canal. So what happened after this is they began to hallucinate because poisonous herbs, hallucination goes together. Anyways, the allegation is that these women use these hallucinations to escape their bodies, ride on the broomsticks, not literally fly, but when you're high as balls, I mean, you're flying in a sense. So flying off to this mountain in Germany, and they would commune with these horned spirits and dance around naked, right? Have you ever seen The Witch by Robert Eggers? It's kind of this image, right? So this was a big allegation against people, right? Now, Sabbatic witchcraft goes, there is a religious technology to this. Now, even if this is not as literal, there is something you can do with this imagery. And so what they were doing is they were using hallucinogenic plants in a practice they called beneficia. See that tie back there. And they essentially use it to have entheogenic, hallucination-based, ritual drug use-based, spiritual experiences where they kind of exit their body through what they call sabbatic flight. Now, how this works is basically when you are under that influence, you have visualizations, you enter a trance, you have a vision. It's not 100% literal. It's kind of also similar to remote viewing, astral projection. All of that is kind of linked. And then you are able to have these mystical experiences. Now, they do not claim that it is like the devil. You kind of get into that horned god, Cernunnos, Pan. I pronounced that one name really bad. I'm so sorry. Sorry to the Celts. Apologizing to the Celtic peoples today. So this kind of horned entity. Now, of course, the Bible does not describe the devil like in those terms. That's kind of how Europeans created that figure using these horned male, masculine, phallic deities that Europeans did worship. I think mostly of Pan. Pan is the one that registers with my brain the most, especially because things like these frenzied, ecstatic religious experiences, you think of Pan, right? That was what his cult was doing. It's kind of a continuation of the cult of Pan. I'm gonna be real. But anyways, they're having these experiences. There's a lot of plant magic in the Sabbatic tradition, obviously, because these people are actually taking these substances. And so you get after Chumbly, this guy Shulky, and Shulky is kind of like the guy for modern plant magic. He's a continuation. This group's called the Cult of Sabbati. And from what I've heard, they're actually not like a physical group. It's like you have these, you dream of the Sabbath 3 times, basically, like you have these 3 dreams, and then you're kind of initiated like distantly, like it's not like a physical organization. Now, I'm not in this organization. I don't know. This is just what people told me when I lived in New York. So take that with a bit of salt. But basically, his successor, the guy who runs it now, Shulky, very deep into plant magic. He has this interesting idea called phytonosis, that when you consume a plant, you sort of spiritually commune with it. It kind of possesses you in a sense, and that there is a animistic quality to everything around you. He also discusses all sorts of ideas like effigies, like using like figures, a lot of these techniques we associate with witchcraft and mysticism, and kind of honestly like shamanic stuff. Like when you read Shulky, it does get kind of shamanic. I think there is a like shamanic quality to the Sabbatic current. And there are certainly people who are not in the cult of Sabbatic who take inspiration from the Sabbatic current and sort of build this kind of antinomian syncretism between pagan and post-Christian ideas of witchcraft and religion together. Like it's definitely around. I will say over time, I do think it's lost a lot of those like Western esoteric type influences and has kind of gone in its own direction. But it's quite cool to see how that's evolved through the writings of it. Now, the next group of people who use the term traditional witchcraft are the people who are using it pretty literally, right? They're not referring to like a specific tradition, but they're saying, I'm doing witchcraft and I'm doing it in a traditional way. So there are a lot of people who, when they get into witchcraft, they want to learn about their ancestral roots and where they come from. This is very common. I mean, when I was really heavy on witch talk and when witch talk was bigger, a big common piece of advice was to take an ancestry DNA test, and whatever pops up on your ancestry DNA, look into that and try those spiritual traditions because you're naturally going to be a bit connected to it. I don't think this is the only way you have to operate, to be incredibly clear. Not really how I operate. I'm very syncretic, but for some people, that's definitely what they do. And they take a deep interest in their traditions, right? They're like, well, I'm Italian, so I'm going to look into Italian traditional folk traditions. And they use the term witch because the term witch is no longer a stigmatized term, right? Everyone who does magic is called a witch. I don't consider myself a witch. I'm called a witch all the time, right? Which at this point, like in modern culture, just means anyone who has a magical spiritual practice, right? And so they're like, well, I'm doing magic. I'm a witch. I'm connecting to my ancestral roots. Traditional witch, right? It's pretty logical, honestly, as a conclusion. And I will say, as a term, I see how they get it, right? It makes a lot of sense. I know some people have kind of dogged on these people and they're like, well, they're not doing an antinomian, transgressive, we are the witchcraft style practice. But I mean, it's kind of a logical use of the term, I'm not gonna lie. And so there's a lot of people who are connecting to their very specific roots. Like people will be like, well, I am Croatian, so I'm gonna learn everything about Croatian traditional religious practices and incorporate that into witchcraft. And so you see a lot of people who are kind of like pagan reconstructionist, right? Pagan reconstructionism is people who are pagans and want to rebuild a specific pagan tradition with complete accuracy and bring it back kind of from the dead. And so there's this interesting current of people who are pagan reconstructionists religiously, and they're also consider themselves witches. So they're looking for rituals, spells, protection ideas, home remedies, things that people from that specific culture they're reconstructing did, and making that their type of witchcraft. This is very cool because basically a lot of really niche spiritual traditions that a lot of people have discarded are coming back to life because of this traditional witchcraft. And I mean that literally, movement going around. And these people also do tend to be critics of Wicca as well. So you can just assume anyone who says they're a traditional witch in any capacity is pretty anti-Wicca, but their critiques of Wicca are often not this moral critique, though some of them do have it, but that Wicca is historically inaccurate and that Wicca has kind of hodgepodged a lot of European religious traditions together that don't necessarily go together. This is where a lot of critiques of the Wiccan Wheel of the Year as being a kind of cafeteria style slamming of holidays together comes from. A lot of these people really want to create true historic witchcraft again. Now, what gets really interesting though is some of them get so into literally recreating their ancestors, they actually become Christian. And so you see people, especially I've seen this with Italians, right? A lot of people are Italian. If you did not know this, there are many Italians in the world. Insightful insight here. But I see Italians doing this most. I don't know why. Italians really love to post about this on TikTok. But anyways, they get into like recreating their ancestral traditional traditions. And what they do is they go, well, my most recent ancestors were Catholics. And there's this whole thing called folk Catholicism, which is the folk traditions that evolved around the Catholic faith. And a lot of these pagan era folk traditions that people who are traditional witches are doing kind of continues into post-Christianization, because obviously when Europe was Christianized, people didn't want to abandon all their traditions. They held on to a lot of things. And then they create like this blend of pagan Reconstructionism and Catholicism and become folk Catholics. Some of them I have even seen full on convert to Catholicism and just say like, I'm a folk Catholic, I venerate folk saints, I do all these rituals, I'm also a witch, right? And this is where a lot of like Christian witchcraft comes from, honestly, like people who say they're Christian witches. Of course, if we're thinking about Christian theology, they would not like the term witch. It's a weird term to use if you're a Christian. There are traditions in Christianity that look like witchcraft, and that's all the stuff I'm talking about. So Christian witchcraft is legitimate. I just think the phrasing of that is very weird, and I don't think if I was a folk Christian, I think the term folk Christian is very good, I would use that. I have also seen this with Slavic people who get into like this hodgepodge of Slavic paganism and Eastern Orthodoxy. I've seen this several times, and actually if you look at Eastern Europe, there are people living in Eastern Europe who basically have this perspective. I also seen a lot of people with a kind of Nordic past get into Asatru, and then with Asatru, they're like, okay, well, I also want to do specific Nordic traditions like rune magic or satyr, and so they kind of create this traditional witchcraft built around that, and they do call themselves that. Or they might specifically just say, I'm a Nordic witch, I'm a Croatian witch, I'm a, I don't know, in any country, that you can do this for any culture because all of humanity has had magical traditions. So yeah, you can do that for everything. Now, my last thing I want to discuss is the term witch really accurate for a lot of these traditions? Now, depends on how you're defining that. I think historically witch has meant something different than it does now, and I think we do kind of need to accept that. There are a lot of people who don't like that on both sides. There are a lot of people who are mystics who hate that they're called witches. They're like, well, I'm not doing witchcraft, I'm doing theurgia, I'm doing something different. And then there are people who are those kind of antinomian, more left-hand path, I hate the word left-hand path, but you get what I'm talking about, witches who feel that that term has been kind of stolen from them, right? And used by people who don't deserve it. And so it's an interesting clash there. I don't know, I kind of see all the perspectives on this conversation. I think at the end of the day, it is a personal choice whether you identify as a witch or not, but please consider what that term means and don't just be like, well, I practice magic, so I'm a witch. That's a good way to make a lot of people mad at you because that's simply like not true. Like I have some people say like, all sorts of things are witchcraft that I don't really think are witchcraft. I do think witchcraft does inherently have a little bit of transgression to it. It does necessitate ritual. I don't think just believing something is witchcraft. I think witchcraft, as many people say, witchcraft is a practice, witchcraft is an action, but there are such clear philosophical implications to that action that it is a little bit more than just an action. It's kind of a complicated conversation. I've done some podcasts recently on witchcraft. I'm doing one again soon. And that's kind of all I have to say on traditional witchcraft. I mean, it's certainly a term that means a lot of different things. And so if someone does say to you, I'm a traditional witch, or you're interested in traditional witchcraft, or you're looking up books on traditional witchcraft, definitely check which of these things it actually is, because these are all very different. They're philosophically different, they're morally different, and they're different in every way. It's not really one tradition, and I think that's important to have. I am Georgina Rose. Thank you so much for watching. My videos are supported through Patreon. Join the Patreon, you get a bonus video every month. You'll get a ritual guide every month. And if you're a high enough tier, you can get custom herbal preparations sent to your house or mentorship sessions. I also offer tarot readings and planetary remediation-based astrological readings using your natal chart. All that information will be in the description. And I also am on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Substack. I'm really everywhere I can be found. And I also host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which is on this channel. You don't even need to leave, and on most podcasting platforms. Have an amazing day, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, wherever time it is, wherever you are. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you never need to have a term-based debate ever again. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!